At my son's wedding cruise, he raised a glass and thanked his real mother. I had spent $79,000. He never said thank you, not once. I stood there, smiling, while something inside me quietly broke. No one noticed when I walked away, but I wasn't walking out of pain. I was walking into power. The call came on a Wednesday morning, right between my second cup of tea and checking the mail. Jordan's name flashed on my screen. It had been a few weeks since we last spoke, nothing unusual, but something in my chest paused. Not fear, just that quiet flicker a mother learns to recognize when something is coming. He didn't ask how I was. He got straight to it. He said he and Layla were going ahead with their wedding celebration this spring. A European river cruise. 10 days on the Rhine with both families, a ceremony on deck, a private dinner in Strasbourg. Very modern, he said, very intimate. Then came the sentence that still lingers in the back of my ears. We'd love for you to be part of it, Mum. It would mean a lot. I asked softly if they needed help with anything. He hesitated, then said the guest list was already tight, but they hadn't booked final arrangements. The subtext hung there, waiting for me to pick it up and put it in motion. So I said I'd cover the entire cost. Flights, cruise, meals, flowers, photographers. I had some savings left from selling my half of the regional library council, money I'd once planned to hold for retirement comfort. But what use is comfort if no one remembers you were ever part of something worth celebrating? I didn't say that out loud. I just told him I'd take care of it. Jordan thanked me, quick and casual, like someone accepting an Amazon package. Later that week, I got the invoices, $79,420, all counted. I clicked confirm payment and closed my laptop. Then I sat with the silence. That kind of silence doesn't come from being alone. It comes from knowing you said yes before they ever gave you a reason to. Still, I wanted to believe in the moment, in being seen, in being part of something again, as more than the person who sends birthday cards on time. I told myself I was investing in connection, and maybe I was. Maybe that was the mistake. The weeks leading up to the trip were filled with forwarded emails and neutral-toned group chats. Sonia, my ex-husband's second wife, had been added to the itinerary early on. Layla texted me once about a color palette for the clothes. No one asked where I'd be sitting during the ceremony. I assumed it was an oversight. Oversights happen, especially when your presence is more utility than celebration. I packed 3 dresses and a pair of old gold earrings I hadn't worn in over 20 years. The day before departure, I polished my shoes until they looked new, or at least newer than I felt. The morning we left, I stood in line behind Sonia at the check-in counter. She chatted with Layla, laughing about lavender hotels and French bakery tours. I held my ticket and smiled when she looked back and said, "Oh, didn't realize you were right there." I said, "That's all right. I'm used to being just behind." She laughed. I didn't. On the plane, I was seated between a stranger and the window. Sonia sat up front with Jordan and Layla. I stared at the ocean for hours and counted the clouds as if they owed me something. Looking back, I think the moment I offered to pay for the cruise, I thought I was choosing to belong. But deep down, part of me knew. You can't buy your way into someone's heart if they've already replaced you. If this story speaks to something you've felt before, I hope you'll stay with me. Not because it's easy to tell, but because silence has a shape. And sometimes it sounds like a mother waiting to be called by her name. We arrived in Amsterdam on a grey morning, clouds stretched thin like worn linen. The air smelled faintly of rain and exhaust, and the sidewalks shimmered with leftover mist. Jordan was already there with Layla and Sonia. They were standing near the baggage carousel, laughing about something I couldn't hear. Sonia wore a silk scarf the color of bone and held her passport in a leather case monogrammed in gold. She looked polished, practiced, like she had traveled in and out of family roles many times before. Layla greeted me with a brief smile. Jordan gave me a one-armed hug, distracted by something on his phone. The driver they'd hired, someone with a crisp black hat and practiced patience, took Sonia's bags first. I handed over mine quietly. No one noticed I'd brought fewer things. I had packed light on purpose. There's no point carrying too much when you're already arriving heavy. When we boarded the cruise ship later that afternoon, Sonia was escorted to the top deck suite. A steward offered to carry her things and brought her a chilled glass of white wine before she even set foot inside the room. Jordan told her the view from there would be perfect for sunrise. She smiled like she already knew. I was directed to a room on the lower deck, near the rear. When I checked the name on the cabin door, it wasn't even spelled right. I didn't correct anyone. The room had no window, and the air was tinged with something metallic, maybe old pipework or salt left behind. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I took out the itinerary and stared at the schedule. Welcome dinner at 7, formal attire, assigned seating. At dinner, Sonia entered first. She was wearing soft blue, something silk again, and she touched everyone lightly on the arm as she passed by. She moved with the confidence of someone used to being introduced. And she was. The cruise director welcomed her as the mother of the groom. I waited for a correction that never came. Jordan nodded and smiled when her name was said. He didn't glance my way. I adjusted the silverware on my side of the table. The cloth napkin smelled like lavender. The woman next to me, some cousin from Layla's side, leaned over and whispered that Sonia looked stunning. She asked if I was part of the groom's family. I said I was a footnote. During the meal, Sonia spoke about her travel experiences. She had been to Bordeaux, to Sicily, to Istanbul. Every story had a detail that sparkled. She knew the names of wines and the right way to pronounce small coastal towns. People leaned in. Jordan laughed easily. Layla nodded along. I watched from my corner and folded my hands in my lap. At dessert, Sonia told a story about a bakery she found in Lucerne, how she'd brought Jordan there once during a rough winter. He smiled and confirmed it, looking right at her. I remembered that winter too. It was the year Jordan called me in tears over his job loss, and I sent him rent and groceries. He had never mentioned a trip. I finished my tea. It had gone cold. After dinner, I stepped out onto the deck. The wind had picked up, brushing the hem of my dress against my ankles. Below us, the river moved slow and steady, like time choosing not to rush. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just stood there for a long while, wondering when I had become a witness in a celebration I had paid to host. By the time I returned to my cabin, someone had placed a small gift bag on the bed. Inside was a welcome note printed on thick cardstock. It was addressed to Mrs. Sonia Monroe. My room. Her name. I left the bag untouched. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. There was no sound but the dull thrum of the engine and the faint creak of wood shifting around me. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was still waiting. Waiting to be remembered, or at the very least, noticed. The next morning, we docked in Strasbourg. The sky was still bruised with sleep when I stepped out of my cabin. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. I made my way up toward the breakfast area alone. I didn't see anyone from our group, which didn't surprise me. They had late-night wine and late-morning starts. I took my coffee to the rear deck. The river looked different in the daylight. It moved with grace, cutting slowly through the city that still wore its medieval bones. For a moment, I let the quiet settle into my body. No talking, no glances, No pretending, just steam rising off my cup and the sound of water pressing against the boat. Eventually, I heard footsteps and voices behind me. Sonia's laugh came first, followed by the softer tone of Layla. Jordan trailed behind, talking to one of the guides. They were headed out for the day's excursion. Sonia wore a linen jacket and wide-brimmed hat. Her hand rested lightly on Jordan's arm. A few minutes later, the tour guide approached the group, clipboard in hand, reading names aloud. I waited to hear mine. The guide hesitated, looked back down at the list, and then looked up at Sonia. Mother of the groom, right? Sonia nodded. Jordan didn't correct him. Not a pause, not a flicker of hesitation, just silence. I felt something shift, quiet and sharp, beneath my ribs. I said nothing. Just stood there and watched as the rest of the group followed the guide into the narrow streets of Strasbourg. I joined at the back of the line, keeping my distance. We stopped by the cathedral, a towering lace of stone and shadow. The guide explained its history, pointing out the astronomical clock, the flying buttresses. Sonia took photos with Layla near the fountains. Jordan stood beside them. I waited near the edge of the group. An older couple from the bride's side asked Sonia how long she'd been Jordan's mother. She smiled warmly and said, almost too gently, that she had raised him since he was a teenager. Then she added, "Some bonds go deeper than blood." That was when I knew. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't thoughtlessness or last-minute confusion. It was a replacement, not in name, not on paper, but in presence, in perception, in every shared glance and every unspoken nod. Sonia had been allowed to stand in my place, and Jordan had let her. After the tour, we returned to the boat for lunch. I didn't sit with them. I chose a small table in the corner, facing the water. The server, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind voice, brought me bread and soup. I thanked her quietly. Sonia passed by on her way to the upper deck lounge. She paused at my table and said I should try the duck confit later in the week. It was her favorite. I nodded, smiled faintly. She didn't notice the way I clutched my napkin. That afternoon, we had free time before the next leg of the cruise. I decided to wander into the city alone. Strasbourg felt old in a way that comforted me. Streets curved without logic. Windows opened to flower boxes. Locals moved slowly, deliberately. I walked without a destination, just following the cobblestones until I reached a small bookstore tucked behind an alley. Inside, it smelled of wood and paper and time. I bought a used journal, nothing fancy, just soft cream pages and a blue fabric spine. I didn't know what I planned to write in it, but I needed something to hold the thoughts I couldn't speak. When I returned to the boat, the evening light had turned the river gold. I sat on my bed and opened the journal to the first page. My hand hesitated over the blank space. Then I wrote 6 words. I am not who they see. Dinner that night was more casual. A buffet on the main deck, people laughing over small plates and too much wine. I took mine to the far edge, where I could watch the current and feel the wind. Sonia made her rounds. She had become something of a hostess, joking, pouring drinks, adjusting the tempo of conversation. At one point, Layla came over and said Jordan would be giving a short toast the next evening to thank everyone. I nodded politely. She smiled and left. I stayed out there long after the plates were cleared, long after the music started. I watched the shadows slide over the water. I thought of the times I had been up late with Jordan as a baby, rocking him through his fevers, warming milk on the stove while I was too tired to keep my own eyes open. I wondered if he remembered any of it, or if those memories had quietly been replaced, rewritten with newer ones that fit someone else's version of comfort. Back in my cabin, I opened the journal again. I didn't write more. I just held it, like it might absorb the weight of the silence I had carried all day. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the soft rhythm of the ship moving forward. Not fast, but steady, relentless, like forgetting, like letting go. The following day, the ship drifted slowly down the Rhine, passing quiet towns with red rooftops and crooked chimneys. I watched from the top deck, bundled in my shawl, as morning fog slid off the hills. I wasn't looking at the scenery, not really. I was watching her. Sonia moved easily now. She no longer lingered near the edges of the group. She stood front and center beside Jordan, her hand on his back when he spoke, her voice rising just loud enough to offer suggestions before anyone asked. She had become more than familiar. She had become established. After breakfast, a wine tasting had been arranged in a small cellar near Rudesheim. A dozen of us stepped into the cool, candlelit space with its stone walls and long wooden tables. Sonia sat at the head, beside the sommelier. She waved the rest of us toward the benches with a hostess's grace. Jordan sat next to her, chatting about notes of cherry and oak as if he had grown up swirling glasses at Sunday dinner. I remembered the boy who once coughed through his first sip of ginger ale and insisted it tasted like soap. But no one here knew that version of him. That version didn't belong to the narrative Sonia had spent years crafting. Halfway through the tasting, Layla passed her phone to Sonia to show her a picture from the engagement dinner. Sonia beamed and told her it was her favorite evening. I had been there too, seated 2 chairs down, quietly refilling water glasses when the waiter forgot. Not one photo had included me. Later that afternoon, I stepped into the ship's library to be alone. It was a small room, quiet and mostly unused. Shelves lined with books in multiple languages, a few magazines, some crossword puzzles half finished. I sat near the window with my journal in my lap and wrote 2 short lines. She doesn't have my history, but she has my place. I stayed there until the sun began to dip low, casting gold streaks across the river. When I returned to my cabin, a printed agenda had been slipped under my door. It was for the following evening. Jordan's toast. The note read, "Formal cocktail attire, rooftop lounge, reserved seating." Dinner that evening was hosted at a vineyard just outside the next port. A van took us through winding roads as Sonia chatted with the driver, asking about local varietals and how late the vines were harvested. She knew the right questions, or at least the ones that made her appear fluent in belonging. At the vineyard, we were greeted with glasses of Riesling and a tour of the grounds. Jordan walked beside Sonia, Layla just behind. I remained with the back half of the group. No one seemed to notice. During the tour, the guide stopped near the oldest vines and asked Jordan to introduce his family to the group. He turned slightly, gestured towards Sonia, and said, "She knows more about wine than I ever will. My mother taught me that patience and care make things grow stronger." It wasn't clear who he meant, but the way Sonia smiled, the way she rested her hand on his arm again, told everyone exactly what they were supposed to believe. That night on the return trip, I sat by the window in the shuttle. I looked at Jordan's reflection in the glass. He was laughing at something Layla whispered. Sonia leaned toward the driver, correcting the pronunciation of the next town. It struck me then that there was no accident in her timing. She had entered Jordan's life just when he was forming his adult identity, rebuilding after years of instability. She hadn't filled a gap. She had rewritten the page. Back in my room, I opened my journal. This time I wrote more. She replaced the stories with smoother ones, the kind people prefer to hear, ones without the mess. It was not jealousy. I had no desire to compete. But I saw, with sharpness I hadn't wanted before, that my erasure wasn't passive. It had been allowed, piece by piece, smile by smile. The next morning, the staff were setting up the rooftop lounge for Jordan's toast. Tables were dressed in white linen. Candles were arranged along the glass banisters. A pianist rehearsed in the corner. I stayed out of sight, watching from the deck above. Sonia came out first, carrying a box of decorations. Layla followed, giving quiet instructions to the crew. Jordan showed up later, holding cue cards and laughing about forgetting his lines. They rehearsed quietly, Sonia nodding at his delivery, Layla smoothing her dress in the mirror. At one point, Sonia placed a small frame on the center table. It held a photo. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew the shape of that image. It wasn't mine. After they left, I walked down and stood near the setup. The candles had not yet been lit. The music had gone still. I looked at the photo on the table. It was Jordan and Sonia, taken years ago at what looked like a holiday gathering. He was smiling. She had her arm around him. There was no room left on that table. No extra frame. No nod to anything before her. I didn't touch it. I didn't move anything. I just stood there, long enough to feel the cold through the soles of my shoes, and then returned to my room without saying a word. That night, I knew the toast would be the final piece, the confirmation, and I knew I wouldn't interrupt it. I wasn't there to be seen anymore. I was there to listen, one last time, before I decided what came next. The evening of the toast arrived cloaked in calm. The river outside glowed with the last of the sun's reflection, glassy and slow. A breeze carried the scent of pine and distant smoke. On the rooftop lounge, the space had been transformed. Candles flickered inside hurricane glasses. Champagne flutes sat waiting, lined like polished soldiers. I dressed quietly in my room. The navy dress I chose was one I hadn't worn in years. It had been too formal for most things, too plain for others. But tonight, it fit the silence I carried. I pulled my hair back, added a single silver pin, and slipped my notebook into my small clutch. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just needed to carry something that was mine. When I stepped onto the rooftop, the laughter was already building. People clinked glasses, complimented outfits, admired the view. Sonia stood near the main table, relaxed and poised. She wore a charcoal grey gown with soft beading along the sleeves. It shimmered when she moved. Layla adjusted the place cards and kissed her lightly on the cheek. Jordan stood beside them, flipping his cue cards nervously, pretending not to. He looked grown in a way I hadn't fully seen before. His shoulders straighter, his voice lower, but I didn't see myself in him anymore. That line had blurred too far back. I made my way to the edge of the gathering and sat near the back. My seat wasn't labelled, no card, no sign, but I knew better than to ask. The pianist began a gentle tune. Then Layla gave a small nod, and Jordan stepped forward. He cleared his throat, smiled at the crowd, then began. He spoke of love, of patience, of choosing family over blood. He thanked the guests for travelling, for supporting their journey, and then he paused, lifted his glass, and turned toward Sonia. He said, "Life doesn't always give you the mother you're born to. Sometimes it gives you the one you need." Everyone clapped. Layla wiped a tear. Sonia pressed her hand to her chest. Jordan leaned down and kissed her temple. I didn't move. My hands rested in my lap, folded calmly. But inside, something quiet and ancient cracked open. It wasn't rage, it was deeper than that. A kind of sorrow that doesn't beg to be fixed, just to be acknowledged. The pianist shifted to a brighter melody. People returned to their drinks. Servers appeared with trays of appetizers. Conversations resumed as if nothing irreversible had just happened. I stepped away without sound, down one flight of stairs, then another, until I reached the lowest deck. There was no one there, just the soft thrum of the engine and the steady breath of the river brushing past. I sat at the far end, under a small light, and opened my notebook. I wrote it down. Every word. Not out of spite, but because words are the only things left when a voice no longer matters. I stayed there for over an hour. I don't remember the cold or the time passing. I just remember the stillness, the quiet of realizing you've been rewritten while still standing in the story. Eventually, I returned to my room. On the bed sat a small gift box tied in cream ribbon. The tag read, "Thank you for everything, Sonia and Jordan." I didn't open it. I placed it inside the closet and shut the door. I didn't need to see what version of gratitude it contained. The next morning, we docked in Heidelberg. Most of the group went on a castle tour. I stayed behind. My feet ached, but that wasn't why. I needed the distance, the pause. I wandered alone through the riverside promenade, stopping at a bench near a cafe. The air smelled of roasted beans and fallen leaves. I pulled out my notebook. I reread what I had written the night before. The words didn't sting. They steadied me. She was not the villain, but she took what was offered, and no one stopped her. Later that afternoon, back on the ship, Sonia passed me near the stairwell. She smiled and said it had been such a magical evening. Then she added, "I hope you know how proud Jordan is of the life he's built." She said it gently, as if to comfort, as if I hadn't been part of building it. I simply nodded. I didn't tell her about the mortgage I helped him pay for, the loans I took to support his degree, the late-night phone calls when he almost dropped out. None of that mattered now. Not to her, not to them. It only mattered that I knew. That night, I didn't attend the group dinner. I ate a sandwich in my cabin, cut diagonally like I used to do for Jordan when he was 5. I sat cross-legged on the bed, watching the water roll by through the porthole. I thought of all the things I could say. To Jordan, to Layla, even to Sonia. But silence, I've learned, is not the absence of speech. It's the reclaiming of space. And I had decided to make space for myself. Finally, quietly, without asking permission. The river moved onward, slow and wide, just like me. The day after the toast, the ship docked in Koblenz. The sky was thick with clouds, and a soft drizzle clung to the windows like a second skin. I skipped the scheduled walking tour. I didn't want to spend another morning pretending I was part of the group, pretending the space I once occupied hadn't been handed to someone else without a second thought. Instead, I walked along the empty deck, each step echoing faintly in the grey silence. The crew was busy with preparations for that evening's dinner event in the lounge, something themed and festive. I didn't plan to attend. When I reached the far end of the ship, I sat down near the railing. Below, the water moved quietly, unaware of what it carried. I watched the surface ripple and break against the hull, and I began to feel something unfamiliar. Not anger, not sadness. Something else. The beginning of distance. For the first time in days, I stopped thinking about Sonia. I stopped replaying Jordan's toast in my head, stopped scanning each moment for signs of recognition or regret. They had made their choice. What I did next would be mine. I took out my notebook and began to write. I wrote about the early years, about making eggs and toast while balancing a screaming baby on my hip, about working overtime shifts and still making it to every parent-teacher meeting, about sewing Jordan's Halloween costumes from scratch when money was tight. I wrote about birthdays he barely remembered, and nights when his fever wouldn't break, and I held his hand until morning. I wasn't writing to prove anything. I was writing to remind myself that I was there, that I had lived those years, that I had mattered. When I returned to my cabin, a folded note had been slid under my door. It was from the cruise director, inviting me to a special luncheon the next day for select guests. I knew it had come from Sonia. The phrasing was too curated, too smooth. She must have noticed my absence and wanted to keep things tidy. I declined. Instead, I took the time to arrange something else. Something of my own. That evening, while most of the passengers were gathered in the lounge wearing feathered headbands and sipping cocktails, I went ashore alone. I visited a nearby cafe that overlooked the river. The place was warm, dimly lit, and nearly empty. I ordered soup and sat by the window, watching the lights flicker on the water. I thought about how easily history could be rewritten, not by force, but by repetition, by offering the same story over and over until it became the one people chose to believe. But I also thought about how some truths don't need to be shouted. Some truths just need to be remembered. And I was remembering everything. The next morning, I booked a short private excursion to a small vineyard outside town. It wasn't part of the cruise itinerary. I didn't invite anyone. It was just me, the driver, and a view of neat rows of vines slipping down the hillside. At the top of the hill, I stood alone and looked out over the land. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting light across the valley like someone pulling back a curtain. It was quiet there, beautiful in a way that didn't ask for applause. I pulled out my notebook again and wrote 4 words. This part is mine. I stayed until the wind picked up and the shadows began to stretch. Then I walked back down, slower than usual, letting each step sink into the ground. There was no one waiting, no one calling my name. But for the first time since this trip began, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. By the time we reached Cologne, the sky had cleared into a deep, windless blue. The ship was scheduled to dock until the next morning, and most of the passengers looked forward to a free evening in the city. I stayed on board for most of the day, letting the others wander through cathedrals and cafes, take pictures in front of old stone towers. I needed the quiet more than I needed the view. In the late afternoon, I found myself walking the upper deck again. The air was cool but not sharp, the kind of cold that wakes you up gently. I passed Sonia near the outdoor bar. She was laughing with 2 other women, her scarf tied neatly at her neck, holding a glass of champagne like she had always belonged in this circle. She didn't notice me. Or if she did, she gave no sign of it. That night, the ship hosted a masquerade party in the ballroom. I hadn't planned to attend, but something about the idea of masks, of everyone pretending to be something else, pulled at me. I put on a simple black dress and walked down just as the music started. The room sparkled with candlelight. Gold and silver masks, velvet gowns, tuxedos. There was music and clapping, plates of cheese and fruit, voices lifted high with wine. No one noticed me at first. That was fine. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to see. And I did. I saw Sonia glide from group to group, offering compliments like little silk envelopes. I saw Layla dancing with her hands in the air, carefree and unburdened. And I saw Jordan. He stood at the edge of the room, watching Sonia speak with a couple from Florida. His face looked proud, too proud, like a man who believed his version of the story had been sealed and bound. He spotted me a moment later. He smiled quickly, the kind of smile people give when they're unsure if they've been caught in something or just surprised. He walked over, glass in hand. He said he hadn't seen me at lunch. He asked if I was enjoying the trip. I nodded. He told me the next stop was Amsterdam, and Layla had found a rooftop brunch place she wanted to try. Then he mentioned that Sonia was planning something special for their anniversary in a few months. A surprise cruise, just the two of them. I asked if he was happy. He paused. Not long, just enough to notice. Then he said, "Of course, life is finally stable." I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. Not the boy I raised, but the man who no longer remembered the weight of everything I once carried. Or maybe he remembered, but it no longer mattered to him. He excused himself to join the others. I watched him go. There was no bitterness in my chest, only space. A wide, echoing space that used to be filled with expectation. I left the ballroom early. I walked along the outer deck and stopped near the stern. The wind picked up just enough to pull at my coat. I closed my eyes and breathed in the night. Back in my cabin, I opened the drawer beside the bed. I took out the envelope I'd been keeping since the second day of the trip. The one Jordan had handed me quickly and never mentioned again. Inside was the reimbursement request for the wedding planning expenses, hotel blocks, flower arrangements, Sonia's dress alteration, the cruise, all marked as paid by me. No note of thanks, no receipt, just a formality, a silent expectation that I would give, as I always had. I set it aside. I opened my journal. Tonight, I wrote more than I had in days. I wrote about watching someone forget you while still holding pieces of what you gave them. I wrote about seeing your place taken, not with force, but with applause. I wrote about the quiet ache of realizing that love, when taken for granted long enough, turns invisible. But I also wrote this: there is still time to choose what kind of ending I will accept. I closed the journal and stared at the ceiling, not with pain, but with clarity. The cruise was nearing its end, 2 more days, and I had been silent long enough. I would not raise my voice. I would not disrupt the calm surface they all clung to. But I would act, quietly, precisely. And when I did, the story they had written would no longer be the only one that remained. The morning we arrived in Amsterdam, the ship eased into port beneath a slate-coloured sky. I stood at the upper deck railing before sunrise, watching as the city slowly took shape. Bridges arched over calm water. Narrow houses leaned against one another like old friends sharing secrets. The air felt heavy, almost ceremonial. I knew this was the final stop, and I was ready. After breakfast, the group split up for free exploration. Sonia gathered a few couples for a private canal tour. Layla went shopping for last-minute souvenirs. Jordan stayed behind, making calls for work. I walked alone through the Jordan district, letting my steps guide me. I passed flower stalls, bakeries still warm with morning bread, small cafes with foggy windows and quiet jazz playing inside. No one knew who I was, and it was a relief. I stopped at a second-hand bookstore tucked behind a bike shop. The window displayed a single novel in English. Inside, the floor creaked and the air smelled of dust and paper. I bought a used copy of a travel memoir and tucked it into my coat pocket. Something about holding a story someone else had already carried comforted me. Later that afternoon, I returned to the ship and prepared for the farewell dinner. It was to be held at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city, hosted by Sonia and Jordan. The invitation, slipped into everyone's cabin the night before, described it as an evening of gratitude. I knew what that meant. One last performance. I dressed simply: dark grey slacks, a clean blouse, the same shawl I had worn on the first day of the trip. I didn't wear makeup. I didn't need a mask. When I arrived, the room was already buzzing. The sun was setting behind the city, and warm light poured through tall windows. Candles lined every table. Sonia stood near the entrance, greeting guests as if she were royalty. She smiled when she saw me and placed a hand on my arm. She told me it meant the world that I had come. I gave a small nod. I didn't thank her. Dinner moved quickly. Courses arrived with practiced grace. Wine flowed. Toasts were made. Layla offered a speech thanking everyone for making the journey so meaningful. Jordan stood after dessert and raised his glass. He spoke of growth, of family found, not just born. He thanked Sonia again for her unwavering support and her belief in him. His voice wavered when he said she had been his anchor in uncertain waters. Then he looked at me. He said, "And to my biological mother, thank you for giving me life and for joining us on this journey." I smiled gently, then lowered my eyes. That moment, that tiny sliver of acknowledgement, wasn't for me. It was for the room, for balance, for optics, and I knew it. After the final toast, while everyone laughed and clapped and moved toward dessert carts and dancing, I stepped outside onto the balcony. The wind had picked up, and the lights of the city shimmered on the canals below. I took out the envelope I had brought with me. Inside were copies of bank statements, receipts, a spreadsheet I had compiled quietly over the last few months. It detailed every dollar I had contributed. To the wedding, to the cruise, to Jordan's early years of adulthood. Years Sonia had never touched, but now stood upon. I had sent a copy to my lawyer earlier that morning, not out of spite, but to begin something of my own, the creation of a fund, a personal legacy. That fund would be directed towards single mothers over 50 who had raised their children alone and were now, like me, learning to stand in new spaces. It would carry my name, not as a declaration, but as a reminder. That presence has weight, even when people forget. I looked at the city once more, then walked back inside. Sonia caught my eye and gestured toward the dance floor. I waved gently, then slipped past her without a word. I didn't need the last waltz. Back on the ship, I changed into my nightclothes and sat by the window. The boat would remain docked until morning. I watched as lights blinked on in nearby buildings, stories unfolding behind curtain signs, laughter rising from the sidewalks below. I opened my journal. I wrote one sentence. I do not disappear. It was not defiant. It was not a plea. It was truth. I closed the book, turned off the light, and rested my hand on my chest. I had not been chosen for the spotlight. I had not been thanked properly, but I had remembered who I was, and that was more than enough. The morning of departure came quietly. No announcements, no farewells, just the usual hum of suitcases being wheeled down narrow corridors and cabin doors closing for the last time. The ship felt hollowed out, like something had already left it. I dressed early, packed slowly, and stood at the railing one last time, watching Amsterdam soften into the pale light of morning. Jordan had arranged a group shuttle to the airport. Sonia had coordinated the times, the seats, even printed out little itineraries. My name wasn't on the list. I had made other plans, quietly, on purpose. As passengers gathered in the lobby with their luggage, laughing and exchanging numbers, Sonia moved among them like a hostess wrapping up a weekend at her estate. Layla waved at me as she passed, her arms full of gifts and travel pillows. Jordan came toward me last, his carry-on in one hand, his phone in the other. He asked if I needed help getting to the airport. I said no. He said he hoped I had enjoyed myself. I nodded. Then he hesitated. He looked around, then said he knew this trip had probably brought up some complicated feelings. He said he appreciated me being graceful through it all. And then he added that he hoped, in time, I would understand that things just change. I looked at him, not as a mother, not as someone longing for connection, but as a woman who finally saw him clearly. I told him I already understood. He looked uncertain for the first time in days. He didn't know what to do with my calm. He had expected a closing scene. I offered none. After they left, I returned to my cabin. My flight was later in the day. I had arranged for a driver to take me somewhere else first. A detour. A choice. 2 hours later, I was seated at a quiet cafe outside the city centre, looking over the final documents with my lawyer. He had flown in from Boston and met me there, per my request. We reviewed the final terms of the fund. The language was exact. The allocation percentages were set. The beneficiaries were clearly defined. This wasn't just paperwork. This was closure on my terms. The trust, which I had named after my mother's maiden name, would become active in 30 days. It would begin with a modest amount, but there were clauses for future expansion. Annual contributions, a vision statement, scholarships for older women returning to school, microloans for women starting late-life businesses, wellness, grants for mothers over 60 who had spent decades caring for others with little care left for themselves. I signed my name on the last page and placed the pen down slowly. My lawyer looked at me and said it was one of the most specific and intentional plans he had seen in years. I smiled and said I had time to think. We finished the meeting over coffee. Then I walked alone through a quiet park nearby. I watched a young girl feed pigeon with her grandmother. The older woman's hands were steady, careful. I wondered what kind of life she had lived, if she had also been erased in some room, and if she too had found a way back to herself. Later that afternoon, I boarded my flight home. On the plane, I sat by the window and thought about what I would take with me. Not the memories of the toast, not the echo of Jordan's half-formed apology, not Sonia's glittering presence or Layla's shallow warmth. I would take the quiet night in Koblenz when I finally exhaled. I would take the moment in the vineyard when the wind brushed my hair, and I realized I still belonged to myself. I would take the words I had written in my journal, proof that I had been here, that I had seen everything, that I had chosen to remember. And I would take the knowledge that the most meaningful legacy I could leave wasn't a wedding paid for or a cruise funded in silence. It was this, a future that remembered women like me. As the plane lifted above the city, I closed my eyes. I didn't replay the trip. I didn't rehearse conversations that never happened. I just breathed. I arrived back home to a quiet house and a stack of mail on the kitchen counter. I unpacked slowly, washed a load of clothes, made tea. That night, I sat on the couch with my feet tucked under a blanket and opened my journal. I turned to a blank page, and I wrote, I thought this was the end of something, but it was the beginning. Then I closed the book and watched the wind bend the branches outside. I was no longer part of someone else's celebration. I was writing my own. A week after I returned home, a package arrived at my door. There was no return address, just my name, written neatly across the front in a hand I hadn't seen in years. I opened it slowly. Inside was a framed photo from the cruise, a group shot taken at the farewell dinner, everyone smiling, glasses raised. Sonia centered in the front, Jordan off to her side. I stood in the back corner, barely visible. There was a note tucked behind the frame, from Jordan. He wrote that he hoped I would display the photo as a keepsake from our special family journey. He thanked me again for everything I had done and said he hoped we could talk soon. He ended with a line that settled in my chest like cold metal. Time moves forward, Mum. Let's not stay stuck in the past. I set the frame on the table, face down. That same afternoon, I finalized my request with the family attorney. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't dramatic. I simply instructed him to make the necessary updates to my estate. The trust I had created in Amsterdam would be separated from any joint family holdings. All previous verbal understandings were to be voided. From now on, only what was written mattered. That night, I sat by the fire, sipping tea as wind scratched lightly at the windows. I thought about the years I had spent pouring myself into the lives of others, always believing that love would be enough to earn place, gratitude, remembrance. I had offered more than just money. I had offered presence. I had offered every version of myself I could stretch into. And still, I had watched someone else step into the space I had carved. I had watched my name drift further out of the story. But now, I had rewritten the ending. The next day, I walked through the neighborhood farmers market. The same vendors smiled at me. A woman at the flower stall offered me a discount on the last of her tulips. I bought a bundle and carried it home in a brown paper wrap. I filled a vase and placed them on my writing desk beside my journal. I spent the afternoon writing out the next phase of the fund. Not just the financials, but the outreach. How I would share it. Who I would partner with. I reached out to a women's advocacy group I had followed quietly for years. I scheduled a call with their director. I sent the proposal, the numbers, the mission statement. They responded that same evening. They wanted to help. In less than 3 days, my story, the one I had written in fragments and margins, began to take on a shape far larger than my personal grief. It became a beacon, a vessel for women like me, women who had lived invisible years and were now stepping forward with open eyes and unshaken dignity. By the following week, I was invited to speak at a local event. A small gathering, nothing grand. But when I stood at the podium, I didn't read from a speech. I told the truth. I spoke about what it meant to raise someone and still be left behind. I spoke about the moment I realized the only person who owed me acknowledgement was me. And I spoke about the way one quiet decision, made on a rainy morning in Amsterdam, had rippled into something no toast, no cruise, no photograph could ever replace. When I finished, the room was silent, not from discomfort, but from understanding. That kind of stillness only happens when someone else's pain finds its echo in your own. Afterward, a woman about my age approached me. She placed her hand gently on my forearm. She didn't say much, just this. "Thank you for reminding me I'm not done yet." That night, I wrote again. A new chapter, not of the past, but of the future. I began to imagine the letters I might one day receive from women who had been lifted by the very thing built from my loss. And I smiled. Jordan didn't call again. Sonia never reached out. Layla sent a holiday card, pre-printed and unsigned. But none of that mattered, because something had shifted. The center of the story was no longer theirs. It was mine. By late January, the snow had melted into thin streams that curled along the curb, and the days stretched just enough to make evening walks possible again. I had started a new routine. After dinner, I'd pull on my old boots and walk the quiet loop around my block, past the neighbors' porches, past the park bench where I used to sit with Jordan when he was small. The air was sharp but clean, and I liked the way it reminded me I was still here. Still breathing, still choosing. One afternoon, I received a letter, not a typed envelope or anything formal, just my name, written in black ink, soft and slanted. Inside was a simple card. The message was short. "I heard about the fund. I wish I had seen things differently. I hope you're well." There was no signature, but I recognized the handwriting. I didn't cry. I didn't rush to respond. I set it on the windowsill beside the tulips, which had started to dry at the edges, the petals curling inward like secrets, folding themselves shut. 2 days later, I got a call from the local library. They wanted to host a gathering for women over 60, a discussion on late life purpose and financial independence. Someone had shared my story. Would I speak? I said yes. At the event, the room was smaller than I expected, but full. A quiet hum filled the space, women shifting in their chairs, coats draped over armrests, notebooks balanced on their knees. I stood near the front and began with something simple. I told them I had been forgotten by people I raised, by people I fed, by people I stood behind while they took the credit and the spotlight and the applause. But I also told them that the moment I stopped waiting to be invited back in was the moment I began to build something entirely my own. Afterward, 3 women waited to speak with me. One had tears in her eyes. Another asked if she could volunteer for the fund. The third just nodded slowly and placed her hand over her heart. We didn't need words. That night, I walked home the long way. The streetlights flickered gently as I passed. I thought about legacy, not the kind tied to property or names in stone, but the quieter kind, the kind built in rooms like that, in words shared between women who thought they were invisible, who now knew they weren't. Later that week, I took down the group photo from the cruise. I had left it in the drawer for weeks, still in the frame, still face down. I looked at it again. Sonia with her perfect dress, Jordan beside her, hand on her back, everyone smiling. I studied my own face in the corner, the faintest suggestion of a smile. But now, I saw more. I saw a woman holding back not because she was timid, but because she was measuring, calculating, choosing. I removed the photo from the frame and replaced it with something else. A letter I had written to myself the day I returned from Amsterdam. It began with one line: "You do not vanish." I placed it back on the shelf, now face up. In the months that followed, the fund continued to grow. Donations came in, partnerships were formed. I met with women who had ideas, who had plans, who had simply been waiting for someone to say yes. I didn't tell them about Jordan. I didn't mention Sonia or the cruise or the silence that followed, because that wasn't the point anymore. The story had shifted, not in one loud moment, but in a series of quiet ones. A woman on a bench sharing her dream to open a mobile salon for homebound elders. A retired teacher creating a free tutoring circle in her apartment building. A grandmother starting her own bookkeeping service with money from the first grant we issued. Each of them reminded me of who I had been. Each of them showed me who I was becoming. And in all of it, there was peace. Not the kind that comes from forgiveness or from being understood, but the kind that comes from choosing to be whole, even when the world offers you pieces. That was the peace I carried now. Spring arrived slowly, like someone testing the water before stepping in. I noticed it first in the way the trees shifted color, not bright green yet, but no longer bare. Then in the early sun that spilled across my kitchen counter before I had time to make coffee. I began keeping the windows cracked during the day, just enough to let the air move through, carrying with it something light and unspoken. I had stopped marking days with appointments. Life didn't orbit around birthdays or holidays anymore. It followed its own quiet rhythm, and I followed mine. The fund continued to thrive. We had just completed our 4th round of disbursements. The applications poured in, women from every corner of the country, some with long stories of silence, others with only a sentence or two. But each one held a tone I knew too well. A woman who had carried everything and been seen for nothing. Until now. I met with a young reporter that week. She wanted to profile the fund for a local segment on community change. She asked me why I started it. I paused before answering. Not because I didn't know, but because I didn't want to give her the wrong part of the story. I told her it began in a room where I was invisible. It grew because I stayed quiet too long. And it flourished when I remembered I still had a name. That night, I cooked for myself. A proper meal. Something with flavor and care. I poured a glass of wine, played a record, and ate slowly. I used the good plates, not because anyone was coming, but because I had decided I was worth showing up for. Later, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and watched the neighborhood soften into dusk. Jordan never called. Sonia never wrote. Their silence was no longer a wait. It was simply space. And I had filled that space with something better. I had filled it with truth, with choice, with peace that didn't require permission. A few days later, I received another letter. This one from a woman in Wisconsin who had used her grant to start a weekend respite group for grandmothers raising grandchildren. She wrote about the first session they held in a church basement, about the way the women cried when someone finally asked how they were doing. She thanked me for the chance to be useful again. I folded the letter and tucked it into my journal. The wind outside was warm, brushing softly against the windows. I was not a guest in my own life anymore. I had stepped back into the center, not to be celebrated, but to be steady, to be known by myself. And that was the ending I hadn't even known I wanted. If you've ever felt invisible, like the people you loved most simply forgot your name, I hope this story brought you something. Maybe strength, maybe peace, maybe the quiet push you needed to reclaim what was always yours. If this spoke to you, or if you've lived through something similar, I'd love to hear from you. Your story matters, and it deserves to be remembered. Thank you for listening, and for allowing this space to hold what so many have carried in silence.